So in the last video we looked at creating a very simple modal dialog, and we introduced the dialog designer, created a couple of simple text fields and some buttons, and demonstrated how we can retrieve the information that the user entered onto the form into variables. So in this video we'll look at a couple of new dialog objects, and we'll also talk about event handlers for responding to actions on the dialog before it's actually closed. Let's have a look at the combo box first. I'm going to make some space here and we're going to add a combo box to the form. So we do that in exactly the same way, using the objects up here, and I'm going to put a label on there as well. I'll change the caption of the label. To ask the user to select something, and obviously we want to enter a list of options that the user can select from. So we do this, click on the combo box, and we find the list text property. And the quickest and easiest way to do this is to right click and select the multi-line edit option, and then we put each option on a new line. So we can have item 1. So this is obviously very contrived. I'm sure you'd usually be asking for something a little more interesting than that, but it'll serve for an example. Now there are different types of combo boxes. Some combo boxes are editable, some are just drop downs and so on. So we've just got a drop down at the moment. We'll have a drop down list so that we can't actually edit something, so the user has to choose one of the items. Now when we come to retrieve the information, the properties we're interested in are usually one of text or item index. Item index will return the numerical index of the value that the user selected. So -1 is nothing selected, 0 would be the first one, and so on. And text will actually be the text of the item selected. So we can use one or other of those when we want to retrieve the information from the user. So let's put that code in. So don't forget to save this. We'll close it, and then if we right click, don't forget we have to update the dialog. So we've updated the dialog. We can now see it's got the combo box object in there, and in the same way that we retrieved the information from the username box and the message box, we can do the same with the combo box. Now, what did I call it? I don't think I gave the combo box a different name, so it's whatever it was called. It's just at the moment it's just the default name of MS Combo Box 1. If you're not sure, another way to do that is to look obviously in here, name property. There it is, MS Combo Box 1. You can of course give it a more sensible, memorable name if you want. Let's do that. Let's call it My Combo. Don't forget, save, update. So we want to get the dialog property. Dialog 1 is the name of the dialog. My combo is the name of the combo box. And let's get both of those values I said that are usually the ones we want. Item index. Give it a sensible variable name. And let's get the other one as well. Let's just get the text property. And let's just display those in another message modal box for now. Put more than the same one, so we're going to use percent symbols so we can have two variables in here. There we go. So let's try that. So, and of course we can choose something. So note, it's because it's a drop down list, not a drop down, the user can't enter anything in there that's not already in the list, so it has to choose one of the items in the list. So I'm selecting item 3, press OK. That's the username we entered. that's the message we entered, and then it's showing us item index is 2 because it's the third item. Remember that 0 is the first and item 3 is the text. So that shows us how we can use a combo box and get the value of the selected item. Let's now look at another object, and we'll also do something a little more interesting with it and use one of the event handlers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a checkbox up here, okay, and I'm going to use this checkbox to allow the user to enable or disable this message box, this memo box. So first of all, we put the checkbox on. Again, it's the caption property that is the text that's displayed to the user, and we'll say, let's call it enable message, okay, and we'll give it a sensible name. So again, so I don't forget what it's called. It's called, at the moment it's just called checkbox 1, but let's call it check enable. And if we go to the memo field that we put on in the last tutorial, there's a property here called enabled, and you can use this property for all objects. And if we set that to false, then the user won't actually be able to enter anything in there. What we're going to do is we're going to add something called an event handler, so that when the user clicks on enable message checkbox, we are going to see whether or not the checkbox is checked, and if it is checked, we'll enable the message box, and if it's not, we'll disable it. So let me show you how we do that. Just save that to the clipboard again, make sure we update it, and what I want to do is introduce you to the AdDialog Handler function. And what this does is it allows us to create a subroutine or link a subroutine to an action of an object. So again, it wants the dialog name, then it wants the object name, which I called check enable, and we want the method name, in this case it's on click. I'll go back to this in a minute. And then we want a subroutine, so I'll call one called do enable message, we'll call it. Now I always put my subroutines at the end of my code. They don't have to be, but that's more logical to me because I don't want to step through them or see them when I'm looking at the main body of my code. Now let me just go back to something and show you why I know that this is on click. If we go back to our dialog, click on the checkbox to select it. If I right click, I've got an option here called list event names, and this gives us a list of all the different method names there are. And the most useful one that we often probably use most of the time for all objects is the on click option, the on click method, because we want to check the value to see if it's checked or not. We want to see if the checkbox is checked or not when the user clicks on it. So we're going to use the on click method. Now, as I said, we want to see if the checkbox has been checked or not. If you look over in the properties for the checkbox, you'll see a property name called checked, which can either be false or true. So that's the one we're going to look at. If it's ticked, if it's checked, it'll be true, otherwise it'll be false. Now, don't forget, what I want to achieve here is to enable or disable the message box. So let me just show you something there. If we click on that, I showed you the enable property, which we actually set to false. And again, that's the same thing. Enabled, if it's enabled, it's true. If enabled, it's false. So logically, if we set the enabled property of the memo box to the checked property of the checkbox, then we're going to achieve our aim, because if this is checked, this is enabled. If this is not checked, this is disabled. So let me put that into some code. So in our little subroutine, which I created, do enable message, let's first get the checked property of the checkbox. What do I call it? Check enable. Let me just double check that. Double check the checkbox. check enable, yes. Okay, and remember it's the checked property you want. Let's call it is checked. Okay, and then if we use that to set the enabled property of the dialog of the memo box, we should get what we want. So we'll set dialog property memo message. That's what it's called, isn't it? Memo message. And this time we want to set the enabled property, and we'll set it to the same value. So in this line we get the value of the checked property of the checkbox, which is going to be true or false. And in this line we set that value to the enabled property of the message box, the memo field. So if is checked is true, then enabled for the memo will become true. If is checked is false, i.e. the checkbox is not checked, then the memo field becomes disabled. So let's see if that works. I haven't made any mistakes. Notice that, let's just put something in here, not that it matters. Notice that I'm clicking on here and it won't let me do anything. I can click this one, but I can't click on the message box. So if I click here, now I can. And notice what happens if I now uncheck the checkbox, that becomes grey, and again I can't click on it. So now this checkbox is allowing me to enable, disable the memo field, all while the dialog is active. So although the dialog is modal, I have that subroutine responding to the onClick method of the checkbox. And I hope that's not too much to take in, but in one fell swoop I've introduced you to the checkbox, the most important property of which is checked. Very rarely do you need to do anything else, and also the most useful method handler, which is the onClick event, and a couple of lines in the subroutine do enable message. I'll show you the code at the same time. So here we have, let's close it, cancel, yep. So here we have this is the line that adds a dialog handler, and all that says is when the onClick method of the checkbox check enable is fired, run the subroutine do enable message, and our subroutine gets the checked property of the checkbox and sets that value to the enable property of the memo field. Okay, now what we could do at the moment, we've got a simple modal field, modal dialog, and the OK button. If you remember, we set that to modal value 1, so that when you press OK, it closes the dialog and sets the modal result value to 1. Now sometimes what you often want to do is to do some verification. Let's say that if the user hasn't entered anything, we want to ask them to enter it. We want to make sure that that's a mandatory field. Now at the moment we close the dialog when we press OK, so you'd have to do your check afterwards and obviously then re-show the dialog, and that's a little bit clunky because the dialog is going to go away and come back again. What we could do is use this event handler business and to run some code when the OK button is clicked, again using its onClick event, to check to see if something's been entered in the username field, and only close the dialog if it has. To do that, the first thing we want to do is prevent that OK button from actually closing the dialog. So I could do it there, but if we go back into the dialog, so let's remove the modal result value that we put in there in the last tutorial. We set it to 1. Let's change that to 0, which means that it won't close the dialog. Save it. And what we'll do is we'll add a handler for the OK button, which I can't remember what it's called. I don't think we gave it a name, so it's probably the default name MS button 1. There we are. Again, it's going to be on the onClick event, and let's call it do verify and close. Okay. Now of course that means we don't want to be checking this modal result value anymore because it's not being set. So let's create our own variable called validated, and by to start with, let's set it to false, and we'll check that there. Sorry, if validated equals true. Now, I might be running ahead here, but what we're going to do is we're going to say run this subroutine do verify and close when the OK button is clicked. And what we want that subroutine to do is to set validated to true if everything's fine, and close the dialog. Otherwise do nothing or display a message. So let's create, hopefully this will all become clear in a minute. I'll create the subroutine, which is do verify and close, and let's say we just want the username field to be mandatory. So obviously the first thing we want to do is to get the value of the username field, and it's exactly the same as we have up there, and we want to say if it's empty, then we want to, let's say, let's put those in for now. What we want to do is, if it's empty, we want to pop up a message to the user to say he's got to enter something. So, and then we don't need to do it, we don't want to do anything else. If it's not empty, we can say everything's fine, so we'll set validated to true, and we'll close the dialog. Another thing we can do is, if they haven't entered a username, we want them to enter one, then we probably, to help them a bit, we want to focus that username field. So we can do that with the set dialog object focus function. Dialog 1, and it was edit username. Okay, so let's just go over that to make sure that's clear. So what we've done is we've changed it so that the OK button doesn't have a modal value, so that, in other words, doesn't close the dialog immediately. We've added an event handler so that when the onClick method of the button is fired, i.e. the user clicks on it, we run the do verify and close subroutine. And the do verify and close subroutine is going to get the value of the username. It's going to see if something's int or not. So if the username is empty, it's going to say, it's going to pop up a message saying please enter a name, and it's going to set focus to the username field. If something has been entered, then we can say everything's fine, so we set our validated variable to true and we close the dialog. Now down here, before we show the dialog, we set validated to false, and after the show function, which means that if we get to there the dialog is closed, we check to see if it's been validated or not, and only if it's true do we do our stuff. So let's try it. So if I press OK now, I should, hopefully, if I've done everything right, get a message to say I need to enter something. Please enter your name. There you are. And notice the focus has changed. So if I change focus to here and press OK, please enter your name, and the focus has gone back up there. So now we're getting verification there without having to close the dialog and do the check first. Now if I enter something, there you go, the dialog's closed, and we've popped into our code after validated equals true, and we get the values of the fields. Let's enable the message box. Press OK. So he says that's our first message modal, which is the username, second message modal, which is the message, and the last one, which is the combo box. So I hope that's making sense. I'm going to do one more thing. We're going to add another button, and we're going to use this onClick thing again. What we'll do is we'll make a button that simply clears the message box. So we're going to use create an event handler that uses the onClick event, and inside that subroutine for the onClick event, we're going to clear the message box. So let's give that button a caption. We'll call it clear memo. Let's give it a more useful name so that I remember what it is. Button clear memo will do. Okay. Remember, if you're not sure of what event names there are, they're all there. There's quite a lot of things you can do. You see, you can even fire an event when the mouse moves over it, or when a key is clicked on it. That could be useful for text fields, or even when the mouse is pressed before the complete click, so just on a mouse down. Well, we're just going to use the on click, which is by far the most used one. And so just remind myself what I called it, button clear memo. So we'll just save that. Hopefully you know what we're going to do. So just in case it's confusing that I create the dialog handler first, I'll create the subroutine first this time. We'll call it clear memo. And what do we want to do to clear the memo? Well, all we need to do is set the memo text property to nothing. Okay, so that should set that. All that does is set the text property of the memo message to an empty string. So now let's add our handler for that new button. It's going to be the on-click event, and we're going to run our clear memo subroutine that we just made. Now notice that I have to put the AdDialog Handler functions before I show the dialog, because obviously once you show the dialog, nothing else is going to happen, because we're doing it modally. So we want to set our event handlers up first. So if I run that, let's enable the message, and of course if I click that, all being well, it's going to remove that again. There you go. So I enter something in there, press clear memo, it's firing the event handler and clearing the memo box. Now the clever thing is, these events are happening in real time, in parallel to this line of code here, while the dialog is being shown. Because remember, we said modal dialogues, the script doesn't happen, the script doesn't continue until the dialog is closed. The exception is with these clever event handlers, because they're done in real time. And it's quite interesting to watch what happens with the debugger. If I put a breakpoint inside one of these event handler routines, run the script, I've put a breakpoint in the clear memo one. So if I run the script now from the debugger, if I press this button, we should pop out to the debugger in that subroutine. There we are. And if I step with F8, notice that we return back to the dialog. And because we're now in step mode and I've debugged, because I've cancelled, we've dropped out at the line after the show function, which is exactly right. So there we are. We've taken our dialog that we created in the first tutorial, and we've looked at a couple more dialog objects, checkboxes, combo boxes, and we've also looked at the real-time event handlers. So I hope that's helpful. Obviously there's so many more things you can do. There's all these properties, there's lots of event methods. Really, your imagination is your limit. That's it for now.